Boss also supported Leppard at Salinas, didn't they? Sydney 84. Was that the first time you met Phil Collen?
Yeah, on the High and Dry tour.
Okay. Was that the first time you met Phil Collen?
Yeah. Yeah, that was the first time. It was just a quick "how you going" sort of thing. Their manager at the time, Peter Mensch, asked, I think it was Zev Isaacs. He was a record company owner here in Australia, but he had some sort of links with the Peter Mensch management. And I had a message, could you come and meet Peter Mensch, who was Def Leppard's manager? That was straight after we played at Salinas. And he said, I just saw one of the best rock acts I've ever seen, and I think you guys are fucking awesome. And excuse me swearing, but he said, I want a manager. And I said, oh, really? And that was Def Leppard's manager and also Metallica's manager. And I was like, wow, yeah, let's talk. And he gave me all his details. And after I said, look, we're doing a bit of a tour up the East Coast. After we finished that, I'll give you a call. So I got on the phone and rang him in New York. And he said, Craig, he said, our drummer just lost his arm in Def Leppard. We don't know what's going to happen. We're in a crisis mode. If you could talk to us later on, I'd love to, carry on our conversation where we left off. And so we left it at that for a while. And then I think in the meantime, Boss had kind of was leaving the record company, RCA. There was a few things, and we never really got to actually carry on that conversation, and which was kind of sad. But it was like a few years later, I met Phil again at Phonogram, because we'd signed with Phonogram Records, and Leppard were with Phonogram, and they came out here to Australia to launch the Hysteria album, which was a huge album. And I got chatting with Steve Clark and Phil, and we kind of hit it off, because just into the same music. They remembered us from back then, and they were hearing a couple of songs that we did at Phonogram, and they were like, wow, these guys are pretty cool. And Phil and I kind of hit it off, and he said, I'd love to help produce your single at the time, which was Heartbeat Away. And I think he stayed behind. And while the rest of the guys went back home, he says, I'll hang out. And we hang out and did some recording, and Phil did some backing vocals on it, on that Heartbeat Away song. And that was released as a single. But, we did so much together after that. I ended up going to Los Angeles and hanging at his house and doing some pre-production for the On the Edge album. And then he ended up coming to Australia and co-producing it with me, because we couldn't afford producers in Australia back then, the ones that we wanted. So I was designated that job. If you hear Lizzie Town, I think Lizzie Town on the Edge album was one of the songs I produced it, and Hold On. There's a couple of that I'd actually done, but it was very hard being a lead singer and being a producer in the band, because the politics, you needed a person to come in and be a neutral. So I'd asked, there was a guy brought in who was an engineer, Rob Jacobs, who worked with Bon Jovi, and which is another story, and worked with the Eagles and a few bands like that. And he came in, but he was more of an engineer. He's a young guy. He wasn't really a producer, and he didn't have the temperament of being a producer. He was a guy from LA and more front than Woolworths, but he just was he was a great engineer. And to be a producer, you really have to be diplomatic, and he wasn't. He was as subtle as a train smash. And it was great when Phil came along. I rang up Phil and said, Phil, can you come over, and I need someone to help produce this. And he said, no worries. So he hopped on a plane with his brand new baby and his wife and stayed with us, and he just really, really helped so much in that. But it was hard, because Phil wanted harmonies the way they were, and I said, we're going to sound a little bit too much like you guys in that. And because we already had that similar kind of sound, because when they did the High and Dry tour, we sounded more like Leppard than they sounded like AC/DC. We kind of sounded like AC/DC meet Boston because we had harmonies, and we're starting to go that way. And I think in an interview with Joe, because someone, when they tour a radio station, said, well, how do you feel touring around with the band that kind of themselves? And he said, no, they didn't. I think Poison cloned us. I don't think BB Still did, because they sounded like that before, you know, and because they knew our history. I mean, Phil wouldn't have come on board with us if we were a bunch of clones. He knew from back in the 80s with the High and Dry and the Boss thing that what we were sounding like. So he knew that these guys, we were just in a parallel universe or something. We were just very similar sounding. And that was not because we'd copied them, it's because we'd very influenced by similar acts over the years. And I just tell you one, it was great when we're in the studio. There's a song called Ride On, which a lot of people think sounds like the song Hysteria. And Phil was listening to it, and we were listening to it back, and Phil goes, God, it sounds like Hysteria. I said, yeah, it does, but I'm going to do you, let's do something. And he said, what? I said, on a piece of paper, we're going to write down the song that influenced us to write that song, because I know the song you were influenced by, Phil, and you haven't told me, and I haven't told you. So we wrote on a piece of paper, and we're sitting there with the engineer in between us, and I passed him the song that I was influenced by, and he passed me on a piece of paper the name of the song that influenced them with Hysteria. And he went, bloody hell. And it was the same song. It was We Can Be Heroes, David Bowie.
Sure.
And we're both influenced by that same song that, you know, made that Hysteria song and made Ride On for BB Still. And he just shook his head. And I said, yep. He said, well, Bowie, we're into Bowie. And he said, yeah, he told me exactly the same song influenced us. So he knew that we weren't a bunch of guys going out there copying their songs. It's just we had, you know, similar ideas.
Joe was a big Mick Ronson aficionado, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah.
Joe Elliott.
Motley Hoople.